Well, it's 8 p.m. on the East Coast, and we already know that Donald Trump's summit with Vladimir Putin in Alaska ended with the only way I can describe it really is a low-energy press conference that lasted all of 12 minutes. I mean, it was hardly a press conference at all. Not only because they didn't take a single question from the press, the United States delegation who had traveled all the way to Alaska with them, the Russian delegation, many of them state-run, but they were there too, but also because they had literally no updates or details whatsoever to share with the public. I mean, this is pretty much all we learned about what they discussed behind closed doors.
I expect that today's agreements will be the starting point, not only for the solution of the Ukrainian issue, but also will help us bring back business-like and pragmatic relations between Russia and the U.S.
Many points were agreed to. There are just a very few that are left. Some are not that significant. One is probably the most significant, but we have a very good chance of getting there. We didn't get there, but we have a very good chance of getting there.
I have no idea how to translate for you what exactly Trump was trying to say there. It was a collection of words. That's what I can tell you. But the big winner of today's summit, outside of all of that, what we just saw, was undoubtedly Vladimir Putin. And that has been true since the summit was announced. I mean, a decade of isolation from the international community ended today when he was welcomed back onto the world stage, thanks to Donald Trump. Meeting with adversaries is something American presidents have done for a very long time, and they absolutely should continue to. That's how you make progress, how you end wars, how you negotiate peace. But the optics of such meetings are always a choice. And today, Trump literally rolled out the red carpet on American soil for the Russian dictator. Trump and Putin then rode together without their aides in the presidential limo known as the Beast, which is something that rarely happens with a U.S. president. I can probably count a handful of times in the two presidents I worked for and any other world leader, and certainly not with an American adversary. Typically, there are weeks of preparations for meetings like this, for a good reason, to map out all of the scenarios, to map out what you want to accomplish and where you want it to go from here. And typically, the hard work of deal-making happens on the front end, before the leaders meet. That was clearly not the case today. And maybe we should have expected that, because the guy who repeatedly bragged about ending this war on day one of his presidency has spent the last several days working to lower expectations, and that obviously is quite telling. I mean, he told reporters on Air Force One that he did not know if they could negotiate a ceasefire today. And Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt has tried to reframe the meeting as a listening exercise, which has all sorts of meanings. But all of this comes as Russia is continuing to make military gains in Ukraine, as Europeans are nervous about the United States' withdrawal as a leading supporter of Ukraine, and as polling released just yesterday by Pew finds that 59% of Americans say they are not confident in Trump's handling of the war, while only 41% say they are. There are many big questions. I have very smart people to talk to, but one of the big ones is, where does this leave us, and what happens now? Joining me now are former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, my colleague Nicole Wallace, host of Deadline White House, who has been talking about this for many hours. I've been watching her, and Ben Rhodes, former Deputy National Security Advisor. Ambassador McFaul, I know you've been talking about this as well, but I want to start by asking you, you have staffed these meetings, you've planned these meetings before. We all have so many questions, but what are the big questions you have right now?
Well, the biggest question I have, of course, is what did they talk about? What did they agree to? President Trump alluded that they agreed to something. Putin himself used the word agreement, at least through his translator, but we don't know any of those details. I suspect they're probably thin. There probably wasn't much agreement. If they had something to talk about that was concrete, they would have told us about it. They would have taken questions. But that's all a mystery. And that's just to get back to your intro, which was perfect, about setting expectations. We all know, we've worked with presidents about these kinds of summits. You don't give away presidential time, even to a loyal ally, for nothing. But here's what Trump did. He agreed to a meeting because Putin asked for it. Then he agreed to host this guy in the United States of America. And then he agreed, on top of all of that, to have a meeting without anything agreed ahead of time. Usually, in normal diplomacy, the agreements are done first, and you bring the presidents in to sign them, to finish the deal. This was the exact opposite, and now we're left hanging that we don't know what was agreed to. The minimalist thing we thought we would get, these are the president's words, not mine, is that there would be another meeting, a trilateral meeting. That was not even announced at the press conference today.
There's so little we'll watch and see what we learn. What we have to bite into right now is really the optics of this, and we have all been to summits like this, all of us actually. I guess that makes us a very nerdy group of people, but we've all planned these summits, been a part of these summits in different ways. Let me ask you, Ben. I mean, I just outlined some of the things that struck me. You have planned more of these and what they should look like, and where presidents should stand, where they should meet than most people. What are the things that stuck out to you about that could have a lasting impact? Because that's really the important question here.
Yeah, I mean, Jen, you'll remember for 8 years I was in charge of the presidential travel and these kinds of arrangements, and I've never seen anything remotely like this. Mm-hmm. I mean, first of all, literally rolling out the red carpet for Vladimir Putin and having the president wait there to greet with him. And bear in mind, this is what Putin wants. He wants to be seen as an equal of the U.S. president. He wants to be seen as being brought in from the cold in terms of any isolation from the West. He wants to be treated with these kinds of trappings. And bear in mind, he made no concessions. Russia has not changed its positions on the Ukraine war 1 inch. Their positions are still recognition of all the annexed territory. Ukraine can't join NATO. An end to this war on our terms, on Russia's terms. No concession whatsoever, and he gets this kind of royal treatment. And then, secondly, I was surprised he gets in the presidential limousine. Right, that's kind of usually a sweetener that you give when things are going well with another leader. And look, you might say that's worth it if you really think you're going to dig in and sit there for hours and hours and hours and actually negotiate something. But then they come out with no agreement whatsoever, and then you have the strangeness of Putin speaking first. Which, again, I don't mean to harp too much on these things. I know it sounds like we're just talking about optics, but the reality is that allowed Putin to frame the meeting in his terms. And his terms are, we're great friends, we're your neighbors. Oh, by the way, we're here in Alaska, which it was an unsubtle message. They sold it to us. It shows that territory can go back and forth, just like we're doing a land deal. And again, those optics are very powerful, as Mike knows well, in Eastern Europe. The idea of two leaders of big superpowers coming together with maps in front of them, without the representative of Ukraine, the country that was invaded, in any way in that meeting. That's an optic too, right? We're here, we're in a bigger weight class than these other guys, right? That's what Putin wants. And he's talking about, we're going to do business, and he's talking about the future potential of the relationship. That's a part of the presentation of this. And then Trump looked like he knew that he had nothing to say. And look, I mean, the most optimistic version of this is that he has nothing to say because he's got to check back with the Europeans and the Ukrainians. But he didn't really, allude to anything other than there's one big sticking point. Well, in the war in Ukraine, that one big sticking point could be NATO. It could be territory, right? So the one big thing could be a really big thing. And then I should note, and not just because we're part of that administration, Jen, but then Trump goes on to say that things would have been better if there was no Russia hoax, right? I mean, once again, he's kind of de facto siding with Putin in terms of what happened in 2016. And then that's it. And then there's no effort to kind of brief out anything that happened in the meeting. So all in all, just to echo what Mike said, Putin got what he wanted here. He's an equal of the U.S. president. He's sitting there with maps of the country that he invaded, talking about what territory he gets to keep. He's treated with all the trappings. The message to the world, not just Europeans and Ukrainians, but anybody around the world is, Vladimir Putin waited out the isolation that he was under. And now we just don't know what happened. We don't know what comes next. And look, hopefully there's some actual credible diplomatic opening, but very little that comes out of this meeting suggests that whatever opening there is on anything other than Vladimir Putin's terms.
I'm just going to note here what people are seeing on the screen as Trump is arriving, of course, to leave back on Air Force One. Nicole, I mean, we say the optics are a big part of diplomacy. I mean, they're a big part of sending a message to the country and to the world about who is good, who is not good, who we're partners with, who we still have disagreement with. I was also struck by Trump I said called him low energy. There's lots of ways to refer to him at that press conference. He didn't seem, to Ben's point, to have a lot to say. But you've been following him, watching him for a long time. What struck you about what we actually heard come out of his mouth today?
Well, listen, the optics are so striking, but I think the substance of what happened tonight is what will haunt us as a country for even longer. I mean, the substance of what happens is that the position that Vladimir Putin had that earned him isolation as basically a charged war criminal who rewarded the soldiers who carried out the atrocities against civilians in Bucha was unchanged. And what I noted today was that Putin 1.0 sort of seemed to slyly wink and nod as he made Donald Trump look like his supplicant. I mean, Helsinki was a home run slam dunk for Vladimir Putin, but he seemed to stand at his podium sheepishly. There was a new brazenness in Vladimir Putin, and if it doesn't keep Marco Rubio up at night tonight, then he's had some sort of lobotomy since he authored the Senate Intelligence Committee's report that Marco Rubio described as the most exhaustive report on Russia's attack on the 2016 presidential election. There is a new emboldened Putin that I saw today, and Trump was just Trump. If Putin had permitted him to take questions, they'd still be talking, and the four of us would be sitting here waiting for them to stop. Putin didn't permit him to take questions. Putin got in the car because that was the powerful thing for Putin. Trump didn't do anything that made Trump look powerful, and Putin didn't seem to be at all interested in any of Trump's pride or dignity being maintained. This was about showing the Russian population who was in charge of this relationship what is left of Trump's enthusiastic support, which, as you showed, it's less than the number of people who voted for him, who approve of his handling of the war in Ukraine. But Putin seemed less committed to not publicly humiliating Donald Trump than I have ever seen him.